Welcome everyone. My name is Mikey Mhenna. I'm the Executive Director of afikra. Thanks so much for joining today's call. I'm really excited about having Alex on the call. We persistently got this call scheduled because the last time we were supposed to schedule the call, Alex had a baby. So it's about the best reason ever to reschedule the call. So I'm really, really happy that we were able to do this again. And congratulations on the baby. I am very pleased to introduce our very special guest, Assistant Professor Alex Dika Seggerman, who is the Assistant Professor of Islamic Art History at Rutgers University-Newark. Alex received her PhD from Yale University in the History of Art in 2014. She held postdoctoral fellowships at Smith College, Hampshire College, and Yale University prior to joining the Rutgers Newark faculty in 2018. Alex's scholarship investigates the intersection of Islam and modernism in art history. Her first book, which we'll talk about in depth today, Modernism on the Nile, Art in Egypt Between the Islamic and the Contemporary Traces, the arc of Egyptian modernism in art, arguing that artists confronted and visualized the transnational context of their circulation. Alex, thank you so much for joining afikra Conversations.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, you are calling us from the States, I suppose, from Newark.
Maplewood, New Jersey, which is right next door to Newark, yes.
Which is decidedly not in Cairo.
Yeah.
How did you become interested in modernism on the Nile?
I have always been an art historian, so I was studying art history in college and realized that these two really important interests of mine, art history and modern Middle Eastern studies, did not overlap. I went to Columbia, and the second week of school, so I was brand new, 18 years old, moved across the country, 9/11 happened. And so that really changed my worldview, and I got really interested in Middle East studies, but there were virtually no classes where those two interests overlapped, especially in the modern. And so when I graduated, I started thinking more about modernism in the Middle East, and studying Arabic brought me to Cairo. I didn't intend to study Egyptian modernism. I was looking all over. I went to Beirut and Damascus and Morocco and Jordan, looked at art at all of those places. And I went to the Mahmoud Museum in Alexandria, and it just all clicked. I saw that art, and everything clicked at that moment. And so that's why I chose Egypt.
So I'm curious about, as you were, this book, Modernism on the Nile, when do you think you first started thinking about this topic? Like literally what year where you first started scratching at this idea of like, I think I want to talk about and explore and deepen my understanding of modernism in Egypt, modernism in the Arab world. When did you first start thinking, yep, this is what I'm into?
Yeah, I went to this exhibition, which I sometimes call the exhibition that launched 1,000 dissertations, which was the Without Boundary exhibition at MoMA in 2006. It was what, back then they called Middle Eastern artists, what now we would call diaspora artists working mainly in the United States, like Shireen Nishat, Ghada Amr, Walid Rad, and I saw that show, and that was the first moment where I saw art that did bridge those two interests, the art history and the modern Middle Eastern studies. But the show was super problematic in its conception. It was amazing that it got the space in MoMA, but it was really problematic in how it was conceived. And I think that's why so many people were inspired to go to study this region. So that was the first time, but I didn't know about modernism at all. I mean, it was so hard to find any information aside from very specialized books, deep in libraries at that time. So that was kind of my first inkling that this is where I wanted to go.
I hate to harp on this, but I'm curious. I'm just like super curious. In what ways was it problematic? And in what ways was sort of not necessarily that show in particular? What ways were people? In what way was the thinking around modernism in the Arab world or in the Middle East problematic or sort of
It
maybe
was,
overly
yeah,
simplistic.
yeah, it was very, and the curator, like the curator is wonderful and,
Yeah.
so great that it was like the first step. It was such an important step, but it was very superficial. It was like, these artworks look like rugs and rugs are from Islamic art. And it wasn't really thought through, calligraphy. It was a lot of those kind of signifiers on the surface of the artworks that were being identified as what connected it. And then sort of randomly, the show also included Mike Kelly and Bill Viola, who were also using Islamic themes. Mike Kelly had a rug made in Iran, and Bill Viola was looking at Sufi practice. But those are not diaspora artists; those are American artists. Mike Kelly was using his Irish heritage in that piece. So it was a little confusing. So the art was phenomenal. I just remember seeing that Shireen Nishat for the first time. It just blew me away in the Gada Amr. It really, really changed the way I look at art, but it was the kind of organization and the connections to the larger practice of art history were really confusing and problematic.
So I want to reread the title, the subtitle of the book, Art in Egypt Between the Islamic and the Contemporary, and really get a sense of why that's the title. And then for the people who are listening who can't see the screen, this is a quote from an article that you published recently. Islam was a factor, but not the defining factor of modernism in Egypt. Often it is expected that art from a predominantly Muslim country will be primarily concerned with religion, but this is not the case for Egyptian art in this era. Islam played an important but not central role in the Egyptian modernist art movement. Was that surprising to you going into the book? Did you expect that? Was that something that you discovered? Is there a pushback from other people who believe contrary to you?
So the subtitle, the way the books are titled, you kind of suggest something and then the marketing team makes the final decision. So I had a very academic, confusing title at first, and they were like, that's not going to do. You need to suggest something else. So between the Islamic and the contemporary, I'm primarily referencing the extant subfields of art history. So Islamic art history has until recently been defined as ending around 1800. So Islamic art history collections and textbooks until very recently just end with the onset of colonialism. So the time period of my book is between that extant definition of Islamic art history and contemporary art history, which begins in the 1960s and 70s. So that's the kind of main, it's just a temporal definition. But I also wanted to say that this artwork is sort of, jockeying between these larger ideas of what is the role of religion and the role specifically of Islam in this art history. It's a huge question that I always get asked. So it was a major question from the beginning of the project. And I guess I was not surprised to find that it's similar to the role of Christianity in art in America, which is that it's there, it's important, but it's not the you wouldn't call Jackson Pollock a Christian artist. However, his artwork is in dialogue with a longer history of Western painting that is fundamentally embedded in Renaissance painting, which is very religious, right? So I think it's very similar, but we don't usually take the time to identify. Some art historians are identifying the religious aspects of Western modern painting, but it's definitely there. And I think it's very similar in the case in Egypt, that it's a factor, but it's not the defining factor of the artwork that I look at in this book.
Is there pushback against that, both from maybe sort of previous scholarship in the States, but also in the Arab world? Are there people who just disagree with you, who are in the Arab world or in Egypt, saying no, this is for sure Islamic art?
Oh, they say that it is for sure.
Yeah, yeah. Is there somebody who's like disagreeing with you in
Mostly
the States or in the Arab world, or no? Not
yeah,
really?
mostly I get this is not Islamic. Traditional
Mm,
Islamic art historians who are generally not people from the diaspora um, have said to me numerous times, this is not Islamic art.
mm.
And modernists, traditional kind of old timey modernists have said, this is not modernism. So I'm like, well, okay, what if it's not one or the other? You know, what is it? It kind of lands in between these two subfields of art history. So that's the pushback that I get. I think, but these ideas are definitely like embedded in the book, that you really have to read the book carefully to. And thank you for pulling this quote out and this idea, because it shows that you're really reading what I've written. But they're really embedded in there, and so I haven't gotten a lot of pushback on these ideas, frankly.
Okay.
Yeah, but
Okay,
maybe they're out there.
maybe they're out there. They will emerge.
Yeah.
It seems like the main thesis of the book is this idea of constellation modernism. Can you explain what that term is and why you think it's a useful term for people to start to think about and maybe start even using to understand other contexts?
Yeah, so with this project, so on the one hand, it was important to locate and pinpoint the role of Islam in modernism in Egypt. On the other hand, it was important to not just add to the story of global modernism, not just add another nationalist location of modern art, but to really change the way we're talking about modernism and the terminology we use to describe it. So I located this term constellational modernism as a way to describe the way in which artists were connected to other locations outside of Egypt. For instance, the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, or Gazzar spent time at the Central Restoration Institute in Rome. They had these very specific and finite connections. So I felt like the word global is really kind of refers to a 21st century hyper connectivity, and that was not appropriate. Transnational is more useful, but really highlights the role of the nation, when a lot of times these artists were kind of going outside of those national boundaries and breaking them. So constellational, if you imagine like stars in a constellation, they're these a finite set of points. And then what the artists are doing is they're visualizing those references in the artworks to create a kind of a map for us to unravel as the viewer. And so I was hoping, the idea was that this term would be applicable to modernisms maybe in India or Mexico or Brazil, that were, this is a term that we can try to start changing the way we talk about modernism, not just in Egypt, but all over the world. So I've had some really interesting conversations over the last few months with some specialists of Indian, Turkish, Brazilian, Chinese art, where we talked about the applicability of these of this term to other locations. So that was the goal with that.
I love it as a alternative to transnational, not only in reference to modernism, but as in reference to a lot of different things. Because I hadn't thought about that, as in I hadn't thought about how transnational relies on the nation. So that makes so much sense to me. I love that idea.
And then transnational too is really about the circulation of artworks. And I'm not just talking about their circulation, I'm talking about the aesthetics, like what they look like and what the artwork itself is doing. And so that is Constellation also, it's a visual technique as well. And so that gets us away from purely thinking about the art moving, but actually what the art looks like as well.
Yeah, it's like the information going into their brains, not necessarily the stuff coming out. Why did you choose to focus on these three artists, Mokhtar, Said, and el-Gazzar, as sort of the subjects of the three chapters?
This book is based on my dissertation, and I did a year of research in Cairo at the American Research Center of Egypt, RC. I'm very grateful to them for their help in making this project possible. So sometimes it's definitely the artwork is artwork that I continually like to look at. And I was talking to some Yale graduate students yesterday, and I said, you know, when you choose your topic, make sure you really like looking at this art, because you're going to be looking at it for, now this is, you know, we're going on 15 years here of me looking at this art. So I really just love these paintings. There are a couple of other artists, I won't name names, in Egyptian modernism. And I was just like, nope, I don't like that. I don't like this painter's style. It doesn't do it for me. I'm not gonna include that person. But it was also access to the archives, the archival. So it's kind of my personal preference. Obviously, these three artists are some of the biggest, most important artists in the local history of Egyptian modernism. And so that was an important thing for not only me, but in graduate school, my committee was interested in bringing these artists into larger discussions of art history, but also access to archives. So Mokhtar's nephew is a prominent professor of archives and history at Cairo University. So he was amazingly generous in being able to share archives. Also, Mokhtar and Said both have museums dedicated to them in Egypt. So getting access to the artwork was very easy. And Gazzar has the most fabulous family who were so wonderful, generous, and warm. I mean, so many cups of tea and sweets at their house and wonderful conversation. And basically, you know, that sort of access is what you need to be able to do a sort of project like this. And unfortunately, I really wanted to include Inji Aflatun, but at that time, her entire like body of work was sort of trapped in this like government limbo, and I couldn't get access to anything. And so without access to archives or artworks, it became impossible to write about it. So there's some new scholars coming up there who are doing more work on other artists. And I think there's more attention now to artist archives. So we'll start seeing more about other artists in Egypt. So it was sort of preference, and accessibility was really important.
I'm always curious when there are books or, you know, any projects that sort of put artists together who may or may not have associated themselves with each other. I'm always curious if you have a sense of if these three artists in particular liked each other's work. Were they fond of each other? You know, were they fond of each other? Were they running the same circles?
Mokhtar dies in 1934. So Mokhtar did not know, Gazzar was a boy when he died, so they wouldn't have known each other. But Mahmoud Said was a very important, especially later in his life, part of the arts community. He was included in the surrealist art exhibitions in the early 1940s, and he sat on the biennial of the Mediterranean, which was held in Alexandria. He sat on that committee. And so he would have definitely, I mean, Gazzar and his compatriots in the contemporary art group were absolutely knowledgeable about Mokhtar and Said. And I don't know of any moment where Gazzar met Said, but I mean, I'm sure they traveled in the same circles. And Gazzar was trying to do something different. You know, he was trying to kind of react against the previous generation and do something different. But they were all certainly in dialogue with each other.
Yeah. This idea of like, you mentioned the idea of abstraction versus figuration and how both of them can coexist in the idea of modernism in Egypt. And there's a really great talk on YouTube where you talk about this idea of this piece, Bride of the Nile, and how it sort of exemplifies that idea, right? Can you talk a little bit about if that's true of all of Mokhtar's work? Did he consider himself engaging in modernism? Did he think figuration was particularly problematic to use, or was he like, no, this is what we do here?
Yeah, well, at this time, Pharaonism across Egyptian culture was very in vogue and was a prominent way that artists and writers exhibited and architects exhibited nationalism. So this is also right after the discovery of King Tutankhamun's tomb. And in addition, this was a constellationally, if you will, or a transnationally resonant art history to draw from. So everyone in Europe, and in this case for Mokhtar in Paris, would have been very knowledgeable about ancient Egyptian iconography. I mean, it would be immediately apparent that this is a sphinx to them. They would absolutely know that. So he's speaking to multiple audiences, and he thought of himself, one of the books about him, there's an interview where he claims to be the first Egyptian sculptor in 2,000 years. That's kind of the like going way that he describes himself. So he really saw himself as picking back up this lost grandeur of ancient Egypt. And that was I argue in the book that he's part of a larger return to order movement. After the tumult of World War I, a lot of artists in Europe, like you might know, Giorgio de Chirico, would turn to ancient Roman forms in his work. A lot of artists were turning to ancient Greek and Roman, and so Mokhtar turns to ancient Egyptian. And so he's part of a larger figurative movement turning to classical forms in the 1920s. And so he would have seen himself as part of a pharaonic movement nationalist pharaonic movement in Egypt, but also this larger return to classicism in Europe.
So I want to talk about Saeed for a second, and in style. Your chapter mentions him as having, you say he belonged to the same generation as Mokhtar, but his origin set him apart from Cairo's professional artists. His Alexandrian origin set him apart from Cairo's professional artists. Is that a meaningful distinction? I mean, is this like at that point, is this like Tupac in LA and Biggie in New York? Like, is this really a meaningful distinction?
I'm from LA. I remember that. I remember Tupac. That's like my identity. Okay, not really, but no, it wasn't like a rivalry, but I think the distinction here is that Mahmoud Mokhtar was a middle class, from a working middle class family, and was supported by government assistance to study abroad, to study first at the Cairo School of Fine Arts and then to study abroad in France. And then when he came back, his Nahdat Masr was funded by public donations and the government. And so he was really a professional artist. That was his job. That's how he made money. And he was supported by an elite group of supporters and the local monarchy. Whereas Saeed was not a professional artist. He painted on the weekends until he retired. He was a lawyer at the mixed courts, which is actually this very fascinating legal institution that adjudicated contracts between different nationalities in Alexandria. So if you were Greek or Italian or Egyptian or Turkish, you could have a contract between different nationalities and have it enforced. And he was a lawyer at this institution. So he didn't make money off this work. So he didn't have to cater it to a client, a governmental or a elite or a nationalist client. He was more kind of doing it for himself in his spare time and his community. It's this sort of luxurious side. I want to say side hustle, but that's not the right thing to say.
Sure.
But he wasn't it wasn't his primary mode of employment. And that's the distinction I wanted to draw.
Okay, so let's move on to Princess Nazli, who is somebody who I was unfamiliar with. Who is this person?
Oh, she's great.
Yeah,
this
what is
is
this? Who is
very,
this
this is
like this gem of
very,
a person?
she's this very, very early in this project. I discovered her and just went into like a Nazli hole where I wanted to learn every single scrap of information that I could possibly find on her. She was a fascinating person. So the great granddaughter of Muhammad Ali Pasha, who was that
Yeah.
the pseudo ruler of Egypt, so under the Ottomans, but basically made Egypt into the nation state that we know it today, was Muhammad Ali Pasha. So she's his great granddaughter. She's born in Alexandria, raised in Istanbul, and her father was Khedive Ismail's half brother. By they had different mothers, but I think only by a few months younger. So she was her father could have been the Khedive, what Khedive Ismail was, but wasn't. So, and then she marries Khalil Pasha, who is the ambassador to France, who is famously in Western art history known as the person who commissioned Courbet's Origin of the World, which is a very close-up picture painting of female genitalia. So this is just a crazy connection. And then he just promptly dies, like right after they get married. And so she's a widow, and this kind of is her ticket to freedom in society, because she's not a maiden, but she's also not a married mother. And she starts this salon when she's in her 20s and hosts all of the most important people, British, French, Egyptian, Lebanese, everyone's coming through her salon. So I always dreamed of being part of that salon. And she loved photography. So
Yeah.
these are some really, and this photograph that I found
She's
in the
like
collection,
precursor to like me, basically.
To you?
Her salon is like a precursor to Mazia's salon.
To what?
To Mazia's salon.
Oh, a precursor? I don't know if it's just, I think that's what wealthy, well-to-do women of the time, it was, I think maybe she went to Paris and got influenced by what was going on there. And it was, definitely, a part of this constellational or transnational elite women hosting salons at that time, for sure.
Yeah. Super, super, super interesting. Okay. The last chapter of your book, and then I'm going to open up to questions. The last chapter of your book focuses on a specific genre of image. And this is image of peasant women and or peasant women holding jugs of water, which to me is a very specific imagery. Why did you want to write about this? What is there to uncover with looking at these types of images?
Yeah, so the other chapters really focus on makers, their biographies, their lifetime of work. So chapter 1 has these 3 players, Nazli, Yaqub Sanua, and Sheikh Mohammed Abdu. And then, of course, the middle 3 chapters focus on major artists. And so instead of focusing on one particular author, I wanted to flip it and focus rather on an image and how that kind of the life, instead of the life of the author, the life of the image, and how that, and then I was just interested, where did this image of the peasant with the water jug is ubiquitous in nationalist imagery and art in the 20th century, but it definitely has a colonial past. And again, this access to materials. I was at Smith College, and I had a lot of access to the Yale collections and online collections, and so it was easier. At that point, I wasn't able to go and do a year of field work in Egypt, but I could kind of mine these colonial collections, mainly in prints. And so I followed this image back to the 18th century and showed how this image it enacts that constellational movement of fluidly going over these borders, going over mediums, first as an engraving and then a lithograph, a photograph, a painting, and ending up, as a really important image for the feminist painters of the 50s and 60s in Egypt. And so that I argue that she kind of, as this image of the peasant and the water jug moves through time, she picks up meaning over time, especially that water jug referencing the power of the Nile Valley, and the water, the flows of the water that were kind of a really important resource, but also a really important thing to control for whoever. And historically, I just was on a panel last week with someone talking about the Nilometer and how the control and the monitoring of the floods of the Nile historically have been such an important part of governance in Egypt. And so that water jug represents this kind of latent anxiety over that natural resource. And that is why she becomes such a potent image in the 20th century.
Super interesting. Okay, I'm going to go to the quick Q&A, and then we will transition into the questions with everyone. And again, if anyone has questions, please type them in the chat. We have 2 so far, but if there are more, that'd be great. Okay, so first, what are you reading or watching right now?
We're still in this pandemic lockdown situation. So definitely reading and watching escapist things. I'm reading Mexican Gothic, which is I love historical fiction, I love studying history. And so in my spare time, I love historical fiction. So Mexican Gothic is set in it's like horror story set in mid-century Mexico. And then of course watching Bridgerton, which is just the most delightful escapist show on Netflix right now. So yes.
Okay, great. Who would you love to shadow for a day, past or present?
I definitely Abdel Hadi el-Gazzar. I've spent so much time with his family, and they've told me so much about him, and he just seems like a really wonderful person. And I just really I'd be really curious to know how he painted, to like watch him paint, something when you study an artist who's no longer alive, you don't have the ability to watch them work. And nobody was taking, iPhone videos back then of him working. So I'd really love to watch him, talk to him, and watch him work for a day. That would be great.
Are you drawn towards process in general?
Oh yeah. So I'm really all about the object and close visual analysis. And in order to really think a lot about the close visual analysis, I think a lot about process. So I have a new project coming up where I'm going to be looking at those artists who were in the Without Boundary show. And so I've been talking to Ghada Amr and Shazia Sikandar. But I love going to Ghada Amr's studio and looking at, how her embroidery takes place, and have done some projects, hosted a project with her at Smith College. And I love watching artists work.
So cool.
Yeah.
Okay. What do people most misunderstand about your work?
This goes back to something that we already talked about, how Islamic art historians would always tell me, or the older generation would say, this is not Islamic, and modernists would say, this is not modernism. That is, that I think misunderstand that, like, you can have something that's in the middle, that doesn't have to be one or the other. I think this is definitely changing in the field of art history, and in the next few decades, we're not gonna have the baggage. I mean, we'll still have the baggage of those divisions, but it won't be as fraught. But that's been the biggest misunderstanding. That when I say that Islam is an important factor, that doesn't mean that it's the only factor. People can't sometimes once I say that, they don't hear the rest of the sentence sometimes. And so that's a misunderstanding.
Cool. Whose work do you admire or are inspired by?
There are so many. And I think I will just choose one.
Sure.
Is Louise Lawler. So the reason that I do what I do is because I was really inspired by the work of artists engaged in institutional critique, New York-based artists engaged in institutional critique, like Louise Lawler. She takes photographs of installed art, which critiques how art is collected and who's collecting it, and the structure of, the economy, and the often misogyny of installations, and so that really inspired me to break out of a Euro-American centered modernism. So I'm thankful to Louise Lawler's work for that.
Very cool. Before we transition, I have one last question. Did you get the sense that the broader Egyptian public, your Egyptian friends from your time there, who were not in the art history world, were keenly aware of these figures? I mean, Mokhtar is on display, but are people aware of these figures?
I just remember talking to, I have two really good friends. I met them like my first research trip in 2009. I went to the School of Fine Arts, Fanoun Gemila in Zamalek, and I met these two friends who I'm still, we just hit it off immediately, Lina Osama and Radwa Fodwa. And this was their fun. It was like senior studios. So they had been at this school for 4 years, and no, they didn't, their coursework was they knew about the artists, but mainly they were, studying Euro-American modernism. When I went to the library, most of the art history books there were the art history books that you would expect, in New York. And so even though there was a collection and the museums were not too far away, they knew who they were, but they were really shocked that I was there to study these artists more, for sure. So, I think it's just about, who's in your community and what's important. I mean, even in, somebody in Kansas, do they know about Jackson Pollock? Probably not, right? I mean, just like a regular person. But if you're in the art world in New York and you're in a certain community of people, then you have a lot of knowledge of art and art history. And so I think it was really, just like in the States or anywhere, it was really based on the community that you were in. So some people were extremely knowledgeable, and, I was surprised that the art school didn't talk more about, have more, but there's just there wasn't a lot published. I think there's more now. And so there's more discussion every year, a little bit more. So. Yeah.
Okay. All right, let's open it up. Our first question comes from Sultan, who I'm going to unmute so he can ask his question. Hold on, Sultan.
Hi, Mikey. Thank you so much. Sorry, I'm going to school, so I'm in the cab. Alex, wonderful book. Thank you so much for this talk. Okay, my question was, how challenging was it to gain access to some of the artworks? And did it make a difference to have access to artworks up close and personal, examining them, looking at them from the back? So can you share a story or so? Thank you.
Thanks, Sultan.
Yeah, thanks, Sultan. Great question. It absolutely, my process as an art historian is to analyze the artworks firsthand and see them up close in person. Even photographs, you learn so much more about the photograph and by seeing it in person. So the Nazli photograph, I went to England to see it in the archive of the third Duke of Sutherland. And it was so much more interesting to see that in person. So yes, it was very difficult to gain access to the photographs. Again, I'm grateful to RC and Dr. Yasser Mungi, who were the only reason I have all of those, my own photographs of this artwork, is because I got official papers from the Ministry of Culture to be able to photograph in the museums. So that was definitely a heavy lift, took many months of meetings and official paperwork signed by many, many people. And sometimes it didn't work. Sometimes I go into a museum and show my paperwork and they would say no. So that was a really, really important part. Yeah, yes. And again, access is really important. And sometimes access is possible and sometimes not. So I'm grateful to organizations like Barjil who are making their collections accessible. overseas, that has been a real boon will continue to be a real boon for the burgeoning field.
Thanks, Abdel. Okay, our next question comes from Ria. Let me unmute you.
Hi. First of all, thank you. Very interesting topic. Very interesting talk. I'm going to ask a question that might be naive or ignorant, but I am always fascinated with the concept of modernism and the relationship of modernism to abstraction, fitting into the narrative of the history of Islamic art in the Islamic world. So I feel that in the context of Western art, modernism naturally brings about abstraction, where they used to be very, very representational, and then they became modern, and they dared to go outside of that mold. We worked in the opposite direction. We started with abstraction because representation was not allowed, and modernism for us opened the door to being very figurative. So I feel sometimes that using terms like modernism in the Eastern context becomes almost a colonial concept, where we're studying the history of the Islamic world art with concepts and constructs that are Western, Eurocentric. What do you think about that? Do you agree? And is there an alternative terminology that we can use to own back the narrative of the history of Islamic art without it being drawn from art historians that were Eurocentric?
Oh, yes. Okay. Huge, wonderful question, which is at the core of this entire field of modernism of the Middle East. And really, this talk I gave at NYU, part of the Taking Shape symposium last summer, we had a conversation where we raised the question, should we just throw out the word modernism? It comes with so much colonial baggage. Do we still use it? Is it still useful? And I think that I don't have an answer to that question, but it's a great question that we should talk about. And I think this is why I specifically wanted to create a new framework, theoretical framework for talking about modernism that gets us away, so that modernism is here it's a temporal period, the modern period, and that's one way you can use the word, but constellational gets us away from that Western narrative. And I think that as art historians have more work to do to point out that narrative of increasing abstraction is a European story, right? Like provincializing. Oh, what's the part? We need to provincialize Europe, right? You say like, this is a very specific nationalist thing that artists in Paris of, mainly French descent were doing for these very specific reasons. And that modernism, global modernism, needs to be defined in a different way, but we're still working on it. Like we're just beginning, global modernists are just beginning to talk to each other more and more, and then we will hopefully come up with new terminology. But I think one thing is that rupture is really important, right? This break with the past. And so breaking with the past means different things in different places. And sometimes breaking with the past can actually mean incorporating a different past. So Mokhtar breaks with the Islamic past, but brings in a different ancient Egyptian past. And so rupture means different things in different places. But thank you for that question. And we could have like a whole nother symposium on the question. So it was a great
Thank you so much. Wonderful. Thanks.
Okay.
Alex, I want to ask you two final questions before we log off. The first one is, what books do you recommend that folks check out if they're interested in learning about this stuff, or even broadening outside of Egypt and sort of thinking about neighboring places?
So you had Annika Lenson on here a couple weeks ago, and she just published a book on Syrian modernism. So Annika's work is phenomenal and definitely
beautiful agitation.
Yes, beautiful agitation. So definitely recommend that. The Taking Shape catalog from the show that on Arab abstraction. Also excellent, recently published, so definitely recommend that. For books outside, just on the topic of global modernism, there's a book by Sonal Kuhler called Worldly Affiliations, also out of UC Press. That was a really important book for me, so I definitely recommend that. And then in Islamic art, there's a book that has ruffled some feathers by Wendy Shaw called What is Islamic Art? And that's also a good and interesting read for kind of working through this idea of Islamic art. Another book that has ruffled feathers, which is also excellent, more like squarely in the field of Islamic art history, is Christian Gruber's The Praiseworthy One, which is an overview of images of the Prophet Muhammad in Islamic art, which is really interesting and super well researched, and it's like a giant heavy book, so hard to carry around, but beautifully illustrated and really interesting. And my students at Rutgers Newark, I have a really large student body of Muslim Americans, and when I show them those images, they're very surprised. So
amazing.
Yeah.
Okay, the last question is, going into this project, I'm always curious if you were sort of surprised by the end product, by what you found. Like if we zoom back like 7 years before, was this a process of discovery? Were you surprised by stuff, or were you like, I kind of know what I want to write and I have a hunch and the hunch turned out right and I just need to actually put pen to paper? Or was there revelations throughout the process where you're like, I didn't think I was going to find this?
Definitely looking back on it, I am surprised about how many people told me that there was no modernism in the Middle East. There wasn't enough to do a book project, that like it didn't exist. And not only did it exist, but I only scratched the surface. There is so much more to do. And so, and now everyone's like, why did you only talk about these like really famous artists? What about these other like really interesting artists? And I think I was surprised about how much there was and how established it was, and how wrong everyone was along the way who told me that it was not feasible, because it was not only feasible, but it's just the beginning of something much bigger. So I think that's definitely the biggest surprise for me.
Okay,
a happy
very cool.
Surprise. Yes.
Happy surprise. We're trying to end all these conversations by asking our guests if there's anyone that they know or that they don't know, ideally that you don't know, that you think would be a great guest for us to have on an upcoming episode of this series.
That I don't know personally.
Yeah, you can know them, but you don't need to like recommend a friend of yours. If there's somebody that you're like, oh my God, this would be a really fun person for you to check out.
Did you have Suad Abdul Khabir?
No.
She wrote a book called Muslim Cool. She's an anthropologist who did work in Muslim American communities and the relationship, Black Muslim American communities in relationship to hip hop and the Black community. More that's another book. Like as I was like writing down the books that I've been recently reading, that's definitely one. She's great, and that book is awesome. So highly recommend.
Okay.
Her. Yeah, and I would. Yeah. I want to bring her to Rutgers. So, but I think she's on leave. So maybe next.
Okay.
Year. Yeah.
That's great. We will reach out to her. I'm putting 2 links into the chat for everyone on. If you don't already support us as a monthly supporter, please consider doing it to keep us going and growing, keep these events flowing and free. If you enjoyed today's conversation, or you didn't enjoy it even, please give us feedback at the other link. And with that, Alex, thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you so much. This was great. Thank you for all your great questions. And the audience for their questions and their
this was really, really fun.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
And thanks for writing the book. Thanks for that.
Yeah. Thanks for reading it. Okay. Bye.
All right, everyone. Take care. Thanks so much.